We weren't very conscious about being left out. It was just the way things were. We identified with Superman, Batman, Submariner, and the rest of them without giving much thought to it. If you've never seen a black hero, you don't spend a lot of time wondering where they are. Today you would, but back then, there were no blacks in ads. It just didn't happen.
The year is 1944, and Orrin C. Evans, a highly decorated black journalist, began writing a series of articles condemning the use of segregation in the armed forces. These pieces would be the catalyst for the United States military ending the policy. Orrin would break the color barrier, being the first black journalist covering general assignments for a widely distributed and predominantly white newspaper, being the Philadelphia Record. During his time, he would be a vocal advocate for civil rights, lifting up his community and tackling societal issues through his prose. During his time working in journalism, he became enamored with the impact done by cartoonists, being able to convey complex messages in a simplistic way, and sometimes not even needing words to portray what you're trying to get across. He saw cartooning as an effective way to portray your ideas through your art, as well as making it palatable to wider audiences. Orrin would take note of a high illiteracy rate in the black community, and he pondered if comic books would be the way to unite African Americans while telling stories that they felt represented them. The problem is, it was 1944. Black folks were seldomly portrayed in any form of media, and if they were, it would be negative stereotypes painting all African Americans out to be lazy or unintelligent compared to their white counterparts. The emergence of these caricatures would take rise in the late 19th century and well into the 20th century with minstrel shows. The average white American would take these caricatures to be facts and a good representation of black people. Although the practice of slavery would be abolished in 1868 with the 14th Amendment, laws would be codified to continue the societal bigotry by way of segregation and social exclusion. The core of this ideology would be separate but equal, emphasizing a racial hierarchy, with people of color relegated to being second-class citizens. When you start looking into the history of depictions of black people in comics, the farther back you go, the more you become sick, because it only shows how ingrained into society racism is, and especially so when you realize that comics originated targeting children. Orrin Evans identified a need to have positive portrayals of African Americans in comics. As a result of this, he was able to bring together all of the aspects that would create the first comic magazine that was created by, for, and starring black people. The magazine would be titled All-Negro Comics. So today we're going to be talking about the first all-black comic magazine, and the Kickstarter that brought this comic back from historical obscurity. But before we get into that, let's hear a word from our sponsors. I want to extend a sincere thank you to Forensic and all of the people that support me over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel or get these videos early, consider subscribing for as low as $1 per month. If you're interested in shirts or hats or mugs that's designed by yours truly, consider going to the newly established merch shop. All links will be down in the description. And now, back to the show. The first issue of All-Negro Comics released in June of 1947, resulting in a 48-page anthology. The comic contained pulp stories varying from noir detectives to an interpolation of the archetypes commonly associated with Tarzan. Evans would recruit editors Harry Saylor and Bill Driscoll, whom he worked alongside during his tenure as a journalist. He would also co-create each character and narrative with local black cartoonists, including his brother George Evans Jr., John Terrell, William H. Smith, and Leonard Cooper. These characters would be created with the expressed purpose of having black creatives influence how they are portrayed in media. Each story would allow for the protagonist to transcend the confines of racial stereotypes, allowing for an inclusive approach to these vignettes. Even in the story of Sugarcoat and Snake Oil, which did incorporate some of the aspects that had exaggerated mannerisms of minstrel shows, it's used as something something to point to and laugh. The story is able to utilize these caricatures as an inside joke, allowing for black folks to reclaim how they're portrayed, a right that had been stripped of them up to this point. The introduction is written by Orrin C. Evans, speaking on the mission statement for the comic by stating,
Dear readers. I'm just kidding. Dear readers, this is the first issue of All-Negro Comics, jam-packed with fast action, African adventure, good clean humor, and fantasy. Every brushstroke and pen line in the drawings on these pages are by Negro artists, and each drawing is an original. That is, none has been published anywhere before. This publication is another milestone in the splendid history of Negro journalism. All-Negro Comics will not only give Negro artists an opportunity gainfully to use their talents, but it will glorify Negro historical achievements. Through Ace Harlem, we hope dramatically to point to the outstanding contributions of thousands of fearless, intelligent Negro police officers engaged in a constant fight against crime throughout the United States. Through Lion Man and Bubba, it is our hope to give American Negroes a reflection of their natural spirit of adventure and a finer appreciation of their African heritage. And through Sugarfoot and Snake Oil, we hope to recapture the almost lost humor of the lovable wandering Negro minstrel of the past. Finally, Do Dillies will give all of us, young and old, an opportunity to romp through a delightful, almost fairy-like land of make-believe. And we're proud too of our big educational feature, a monthly historical calendar on which the contributions of the Negro to world history will be set forth in each issue.
After the introduction, we open with a 15-page lead story, illustrated by John Terrell, titled Ace Harlem. The story begins with two well-dressed men entering a local barbecue restaurant, with one of the men holding the owner at gunpoint. Before the owner can relinquish the money to the men, the other robber then tells the owner to spin around or else he'll be murdered. However, the moment that the owner turns away, he's subsequently choked to death by a metal chain. The two men take the cash from the register and speed out of the diner, knocking over the owner's daughter as she arrives to witness the crime scene. Once she's able to fully understand the gravity of the situation, she immediately contacts the police. We then cut to a black detective entering the diner, designed to evoke the imagery of the then popular pulp detective Dick Tracy. We witness as Ace Harlem dissects the crime scene, looking for clues and interviewing the daughter to potentially solve the case. There's a fascinating aspect of Ace Harlem, which is black police officers in the 1940s. While at the time it was uncommon for African Americans to be on the force, it wasn't unheard of. Black officers were still subjected to the same racial discrimination of the time, with their authority being lessened to their white counterparts, and typically being relegated to only patrolling black neighborhoods. I think there's something profound there about creating a pulp character that serves as a stark contrast to the popular detectives at the time. It's able to present Ace Harlem as a protector of a community that would routinely fall victim to racial inequity, and thus making him some sort of folk hero. Ace Harlem would set the bar for the stories to come later in the issue, showing that you can do black protagonists in a positive light, and you don't have to capitulate to the standard depictions. He's a black detective that's able to utilize his cunning and wit to defend a marginalized community, ending the story solving the case. From the gritty realism of noir detective stories, the book then shifts focus to a fairy tale of the Doodillies, illustrated by Lynn Cooper. The narration explains that Doodillies are cherub-like beings that are only perceivable by children. The story introduces us to Bubbles and Bibber, two Doodillies meeting for the first time, with the former having wings and the latter having a tail akin to mermaids. We watch as these two meet, and they begin to see how their attributes inform their lived experiences, with Bubbles being inexperienced in the life within water, and Bibber inexperienced in the life outside of the pond. It's not hard to see the intended messages of acceptance and unity regardless of our background. I mean, that was the express purpose from Orrin Evans when he was going into making this comic, utilizing cartooning as a method of conveying complex ideas in a way that's palatable. The stories of Doodillies and Sugarfoot and Snake Oil evoke the aspects of African folk tales, didactic fables used to instill moral and philosophical stories to children. These African folk tales tales would be traditionally passed between generations, with African slaves trading stories of Briar Rabbit, an anthropomorphic trickster and troublemaker that's typically pursued by Briar Fox and Briar Bear. Joel Chandler Harris, which was a journalist from Atlanta during the post-Reconstruction era, would compile the stories that were told to him during his time at Turn World Plantation. He would take these stories and adapt them for mass consumption. There would be 7 books in the series, with an ongoing narrator by the name of Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus would be a fictionalized portrayal of the slaves that Harris met and told these stories to him. So he would listen to the stories from enslaved people, steal them, and then make a profit from it. Even when the stories derived from African folk tales, they were gentrified for the consumption of white people. This strips them of the ownership and cultural significance of these stories, bastardizing them by way of perspective as well as authenticity. And also the stories would be adapted into Disney's Song of the South, because they thought that was a good idea. Moving on in the comic, we're introduced to Lion Man, the first black superhero, illustrated by George Evans Jr. The foreword establishes the foundation for what we should know about Lion Man, with it stating, American-born, college-educated Lion Man is a young scientist sent by the United Nations to watch over the fearsome Magic Mountain of the African Gold Coast. Within its crater lies the world's largest deposit of uranium, enough to make an atom bomb that could destroy the world. Lion Man's job is to report on the doings of any treacherous nation that might seek to carry away any of the lethal stuff for the purpose of war. Lion Man has been warned against agents of a certain warlike nation who might try to smuggle some of the mountain's treasure out of Africa. His scientific instruments indicate a ship has moved up a nearby river. With this characterization, it's not a stretch of the imagination that Lion Man would be the prototype for what would later become Black Panther. Now, I'm not accusing anybody of stealing or swiping, but I do think it's not a coincidence that Lion Man is in Africa and protecting this deposit that's within the earth from being stolen from foreign nations. Continuing from Ace Harlem's depiction of black men as a protagonist, and in these classic pulp hero roles, Lion Man is quickly differentiated from the standard fare. I think that it's notable that he's an African American that's college educated, working for the newly established United Nations, serving as the sole protector of Earth, keeping it from annihilation. Lion Man is immediately established to be successful in his pursuits, trusted by the preeminent authority on worldwide unity. Using his intellect, strength, and prowess for scientific discovery, we witness as he combats the forces attempting to take ownership of the uranium supply. He's also accompanied by his very own sidekick named Bubba. Bubba is explained to be an orphan discovered by Lion Man during one of his adventures and adopted as his ward. The allusions to Batman is not lost on me, but I do think that it's interesting and fascinating how these inspirations could be visible in the foundation of this character without it feeling derivative. Outside of the main stories that we've discussed up to this point, there's also supplemental material that helps to further define the magazine. From a 2-page prose thriller, a 1-page comedy piece that played with Afro-futuristic dress, and another following the sitcom-esque daily life of its titular character, Lil Eggy. Each of these stories would paint the picture for the tapestry that was being established, as well as the potential avenues going forward in its publication, but issue 2 was never released. The creative team had already finished the entirety of the second issue, but as Orrin went to take it to be published, his source for newsprint had declined to work with him. Thinking that this is just a weird one-off, Orrin would take the issue to multiple alternate vendors, with all of them expressing the similar sentiments. The first all-black comic magazine was halted after the publication of issue 1. Orrin Evans wasn't confrontational in his politics, and he thought that the path to racial equity is appeasing the powers that be and seeking unity. His family would later claim that he had a sneaking suspicion suspicion that the larger comic publishers had called for a cease to this publication as they were encroaching on their business. And I'm going to take that suspicion one step further and assume that that's probably what happened. But there's probably something underlying that's even more sinister. It's of my opinion that the comic publishers had probably halted the production of this comic magazine because they didn't want comics to be seen as a potential avenue to further the voice of marginalized people. I don't think that it's outside of the realm of possibility that the comic publishers saw a comic magazine that was created by, for, and starring black people, and they wanted to enforce the racial hierarchy as well as maintaining their profits. The loss of the comic magazine wouldn't stop Orrin, as he would return to journalism. From there, he would rise to the rank of editor at the Chester Times and the Philadelphia Bulletin. Later in his life, he would become the director of the Philadelphia Press Association and an officer of the Newspaper Guild of Greater Philadelphia. He remained a champion for civil rights, covering the National Urban League and NAACP events more than any other reporter, as he sought to make their pleas heard. Upon his death, the New York Times referred to him as the Dean of Black Reporters. Comic historian Tom Christopher described Evans by stating, "Orrin C. Evans's contributions to the comic industry is important to us today not only because he was the first black publisher, but because he was an exceptional intellect from outside the field who saw the great potential in comic books as a medium for both entertainment and education, and who had the determination to see his dreams through to reality." And to get an additional perspective, I reached out to comic YouTuber BJ Kicks to get his perspective on the book.
Being a Black American is like to almost always have to have a reverence for history. My grandmother, just in my family, was the first in our family to go to college. She ended up with like an Ivy League master's degree, but she grew up on a farm. But that's the backdrop of my upbringing. Education is super important. And for me, Black history has just always been fun for me. And so when you find out about these like sort of little known figures and their accomplishments, it's like fuel to kind of keep you going, especially in times like these we're living in now, where it's like it's very tense politically. And so it's really fun to be able to look back and understand that people did a lot more when the stakes were a lot higher. So like someone like Orrin C. Evans, to be that principled, to be that courageous in a time like that, to then take all of that energy and tenacity and say, you know what, I'm going to start a comic book company because I think these comics can be a great way to reach the next generation and really provide some uplift for the community. So for someone to do that and then go through all the steps, create a whole company and see it through is just, that's an accomplishment in and of itself. And I think some of the, unfortunate lore after the fact just kind of increases the legend, like to have done something so radical, even though like the pages of the comics are not all that radical. Like if I tell you this guy is doing exposés on like Black soldiers in World War II, you would think the comic would be like super political and like, maybe even anti-white for the time. And then you read the comic and it's like, there's none of that there. It's just cool stories featuring Black people. And so, but for someone to have that frame of mind to do all of that, it feels like a revolutionary act. And I think I gravitated toward it because of that. Even the idea that this United Nations would send a Black man, college educated or not, but send a Black man to protect a resource in Africa, that it feels revolutionary. It's just on its face. Like in a world where you're like, hey, Black soldiers can't get treated well after the war, you're also like, actually, this brother got sent to Africa to protect this deposit of uranium. Now, I guess the question could be like, is it under United Nations control? Like what's going on? But it certainly feels like we're protecting this mound from those who would seek to exploit it, dare I say, colonize it. That's crazy. That's so groundbreaking for the time. Like you said, the Revolutionary Act is the storytelling itself. But like reading the Lion Man story and then seeing like some of the similarities that Lion Man's whole upbringing or story has to Black Panther, which doesn't come out for like another 20 years after the fact. And it's just like, okay, that's cool. And it's like, it's not just, oh, cool, Black people were doing this in the 40s. It's like, look at the types of storytelling there were. There is no greater community than the comics community. I think the joy of literature and art as a whole is that it helps us reflect the human experience. And I think the more perspectives that you find, the more you realize like we are all very, very similar, despite the differences that people want to highlight and profit from. It's like we're sharing this planet and we're sharing a whole lot more than that if you just look a little bit deeper than the surface.
On November 8th of 2022, comic editor and author Chris Robinson announced a Kickstarter that would be remastering and republishing the comic for a modern audience. Since the time of publication, All-Negro Comics was thought to be lost to time and fading into obscurity of comic history. Chris Robinson announced the campaign with a mission statement of not only reviving the comic for the preservation of comic history, but also for Black history. The Kickstarter campaign gained substantial support with 656 backers and being able to fulfill way beyond the estimated amount to publish the book. As a result, the Kickstarter would be able to reprint the original stories, maintaining the original coloring and authenticity of the work. But it also wouldn't stop there, because they would recruit numerous Black creatives in the modern day telling new stories with these characters. It was announced on August 19th of 2025 that Image Comics had greenlit a wider distribution of the reprinting, with it releasing to comic shops on October 22nd. Thankfully, I was actually able to pick up a copy of it for myself during that time, but I wasn't able to sit down and read it until the holidays. I just found that the stories were captivating. Not only the stories that are told within the comic issue, but also the real-world history of how the comic was made. In all honesty, I fell in love with the authenticity of the original works, but also the modern pieces that are able to shed light on what these characters and stories would look like in the modern day. Chris Robinson says in the foreword of the book that there are 3 core tenets in this reprinting, which are tell, teach, and tribute. What this means is to make sure that people are aware of the reprinting of this book, teaching about the importance of this book in regards to comic history and Black history, and also paying homage to the original creators. This sentiment moved me, which in turn, I guess, made me want to make this video, to pay homage to the original creators as well as the modern creators bringing this book to life. And after reading this book, I reached out to the facilitator of this comic being in my hands today, Chris Robinson, and we sat down to talk about the historical importance of this book. When were you first introduced and aware of the book in Orrin C. Evans?
It was a total happenstance, accidental. I've like I said, I've been in comics professionally for a long time, but even before that as a fan, and I didn't even find out about it until 2014, something like that. That is when I first sort of stumble upon mentions somewhere, Golden Age fan forums, that type of thing. So it was like totally an accident. And, I would like to say that I've done my research. Like I was a fan of Golden Age and Silver Age comics, and the, you hear about the big pillars, right? Marvel Comics #1 and Captain America comics, Detective Comics, like all the big milestone starts for the industry and these characters that we know and love today, but never heard about All-Negro Comics #1. Once I heard about it, then the journey of like, okay, where do I see this? How do I find a copy? And it's like, oh, it's not to be found. It's not a thing that is just readily accessible, and certainly not readily accessible in a format that I think matches its importance. But like I said, some of the other comics I mentioned, you can find a copy of Marvel Comics #1 right now and be able to read that easily, and I'm sure tons of different formats. What makes it unique is that it doesn't have like a corporate overlord like continuing to like squeeze money out of it, essentially. So the fact that it's a public domain project, or it's fallen into the public domain, means it's sort of like not exploitable in the same way. But, you know, just from a historical importance to me as like someone working in the industry and trying to find those important indicators that like we belong in the industry, you know, like you already mentioned it, but I was already a huge fan of Milestone Comics, very big into that. Christopher Priest, Jim Owsley, like his whole journey, you know, into the industry was, you know, always fascinated by him. Larry Hama, you know, not black, but definitely a trailblazer in terms of like being the representative in the office, you know, comics offices to consider other viewpoints and that sort of thing. But Orrin C. Evans, when I heard about him, like I was blown away because it predated any of these other folks that I'm talking about. It became a little bit of like a personal mission to like look into him, find out more, you know, dig up what I can, see who else is in the space, like keeping this history around, and it resulted in this book.
Whenever you were going about reading these for the first time, which was the story that stood out to you in particular?
I mean, I was always shocked, right, at the Black Panther Lion Man comparison, because, you know, Lion Man predates Black Panther by 13 years, 15 years, something like that, and they're pretty one-to-one, like they're very similar, like, you know, in a way that you're like, if they were still pursuing it at the time, it's like, oh, this feels like a copyright issue. So yeah, that one jumped up, like, you know, right out of the gate. I think I am impressed by, you know, what you're talking about in terms of like it had something for everyone, and that's something, you know, didn't happen by accident. You know, Orrin Evans mentions this in his introduction letter at the beginning of the issue, that it was for the whole family. Like it was a magazine in the sense that they used to be, you know, on the newsstands right next to, you know, everything else that encompassed entertainment at the time, right? But it added to a really nice package, especially when 2014 I was like getting into editing comics for the first time, and so that was something I took with me in terms of like, when you do an anthology, how can you set it apart? And it's like these extra features, you know, it's not just having 10 stories, it's like having 10 stories and then a couple of one-pagers, or, you know, some text, you know, whether it's, you know, a letter column or reaching out to the audience in a different way. Activity pages was like something I used to do in Marvel Comics when I was editing those types of stuff. So I think the form factor was not lost on me at the time, you know?
What was the restoration process like? When did you know that you wanted to pursue restoring this book for consumption in the modern day?
Let me, like, a very slight distinction, because restoring is like a process if we had the original boards, like the actual art. This is more of like a remastering. It's digital. So there are copies out there in certain closed collections. We had access to scans. I worked with Tony Washington, who's this incredible illustrator, colorist. He does music too. He's like a really quadruple talented guy. And so we had scans of the issue, and we were like, we want to make it palatable to people today. That didn't mean, you know, make it look brand new. I think, you know, there are plenty of remastered or reprinted Golden Age comics out there today that kind of, you would have to talk to the people who put those books together, but they sort of like look different than I think what was intended. They don't embrace their age, and we wanted to embrace the age, not run away from the fact that like this is an old comic and very slight retouching. Again, we didn't want to add to anything. We wanted to just take what was there and just make it, like I said, palatable to be able to read today and feel complete. We thought a lot about it, and we had a lot of conversations about like what looks good to us. So I didn't do this project until like 2020, something around there. Was when I started getting back into like figuring out how to do it. Had the idea in 2014, and at that point I was like, oh, we should just do a reprint, and then, you know, just to make it available, accessible, all that stuff. But it wasn't until, by trade, I'm not a comics historian, I would say. I've sort of become one on this one specific book in the interim, but at the time I was sort of like, you know, learning things like the difference between remastering and restoring, and, you know, how would you track down the boards and the original art, and it's like you're probably never going to find those, so that's not an option, you know. So it was sort of like taking what was available, working from there to put a spotlight on a piece of history that people have forgotten about. It's a book that I sort of made to be shared. The edition that I did on Kickstarter, you know, just for the economics of like, you know, I'm just a guy and I'm not printing that many copies, it was kind of expensive. It was also a hardcover, but, you know, and I was happy to do that, and I was happy to, and thank you for mentioning the donation program that we ran. We donated, the final tally was like 470 something, and I just rounded up. So we ended up sending out 500 copies to different libraries and schools and correctional programs and things like that. That was awesome. People really supported that. But then after that, it was like, how do I get this out there more? The soft cover through Image that you held up a few minutes ago, like that is it's $12, right? If you're at a shop and you're curious, if you're like, what's that? I feel like that's not an amount that people think that would think too hard about. And also it's in Hoopla and other, library apps too. So like check on there if your literal local branch doesn't have it, but you can also just ask them and they can figure out, order it somehow and get it to you guys. The accessibility is like through the roof now, which is great.
Diversity and representation have been a constant topic in conversation in the comics industry, with the usual subjects being up in arms over the sheer mention of somebody that is not a straight white man. It's a topic that's near and dear to me, especially considering how much research I do into each comic creator and the lives that they have beyond comics. When you look at the current landscape of the comic industry, it has improved compared to previous decades, but we still have a long way to go. The industry needs fresh perspectives and representation for the characters that are on the page, as well as the creators that bring them to life. Both Marvel and DC have become over-reliant on these aging creators that have been in the industry for 30 plus years, and inevitably will lead to the halting of progression in the industry. How is anything supposed to move forward if we're relying on creators of the past? Both of the big two comic publishers are culprits of just reusing that same pool of talent and stagnating, closing the door on any new perspectives or new creators that have a fresh approach. And really, we can't move forward as a medium if we're just retelling the same old stories. And now whenever you look at the new books that are being published, it's an aging population of creators that are coasting off of the success of their work in their younger years, and now just coming back to retell these same stories and manufactured nostalgia that is only prolonging the death of the comic industry. If I was to point to a specific example, I'd have to think about it. I'm just kidding, it's Ram V, who's one of the most critically acclaimed creators in the modern day, being able to understand what came before, but recontextualizing it within the perspective only he can. Most recently, Ram V and Evan Cagle's The New Gods was able to adopt aspects of Hindu mythology, which adds for another layer of depth and understanding. It's looking at these comic stories that could realistically be two-dimensional and giving them another layer of depth, making them fully rounded, and all based on the perspective of the creators. The absence of varying cultures and perspectives are just going to lead to an Ouroboros or an amalgamation that's homogenous and doesn't stand outside of the norm, which is obviously going to lead to decreasing sales. It's in the big two's benefit to expand past what worked in the past. The best and most interesting stories are those that adopt the aspects and lived experience of one person, but are relatable in their depiction of the human experience. So we should be calling for representation within the comic industry, demanding the world that we would want to see, because a status quo that is unchallenged remains just that. Well, that's going to be enough out of me. Thank you so much to Chris Robinson and BJ Kicks for joining me on this episode. The links to their socials will be below. Please just support them in any way possible. And also, thank you for watching this video. And if you haven't already, give it a like or hype it. I have no possible idea what that does for the video's performance, but anything to appease the almighty algorithm. Oh yeah, and one last thing. Go read this comic, or else.